أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وهدينا وحبيب قلوبنا والشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. قال الله العظيم في محكم كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق والأصدق القائلين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا إنا خلقنا الإنسان من نطفة أمشاج نبتليه فجعلناه سميعا بصيرا إنا هديناه السبيل إما شاكرا وإما كفورا إنا أعتدنا للكافرين سلاسل وأغلالا وسعيرا إن الأبرار يشربون من كأس كان مزاجها كافورا أين يشرب بها عباد الله يفجرونها تفجيرا. آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. Last week we began to take a look at the introductory verses to chapter 76 of the Holy Quran. This chapter that was revealed in the holy city of Medina, at least the majority of it, according to our Mufassirin. Surah al-Dahr, otherwise known as Surah al-Insan. And we began to talk about the primary goals and objectives of this chapter of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I mentioned to you all last week, and undoubtedly perhaps beneficial for us to remind ourselves once again this evening, that whenever we begin any discourse of any given chapter of the Holy Quran, it's important that we seek toward pulling out the major themes of that given chapter. A lot of times when we're reciting Quran, we go through these ayat and we go through these verses and we're totally unsure of why is it that God is speaking about this topic and then shifting to this topic and then shifting to this topic. And it doesn't necessarily make sense when we read it on the surface. A lot of times people, they ask this question. That when you recite, for instance, Surah al-Baqarah, which is a very, very lengthy chapter, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about, the creation of Adam. And then soon thereafter, he talks about the story of Moses. And then after that, he talks about the laws of inheritance. And then later on, he speaks about, once again, the, Bani Israel. And what's going on over here, and why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is jumping from topic to topic? How does that make any sense? So on and so forth is a common question that many people, they often engage. It's important to keep in mind that there is a wisdom that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to extract as a major theme from that chapter. And the only way that we're able to extract it is by reading it as often as we possibly can and contemplating it time and time again, so that we're able to pull out some of these wisdoms. So amongst the main themes or objectives or goals of Surah al-Insan, at the very least, is to remind ourselves of our purpose in front of Allah Azza wa Jal, and to humble ourselves in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This chapter was revealed in Medina, so unlike many of the Meccan chapters that generally speak toward common themes around Tawheed, around personal responsibility, many chapters that were revealed in Medina speak more toward legal responsibilities. Yet Surah al-Insan doesn't do that, meaning it is revealed in the latter years of the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but still reminds us of those same ethical values that speak of man's relationship with their Lord. Perhaps as a reminder of that which that early Muslim community was taught in Mecca, now later on at the establishment of the state. But also because oftentimes when people feel a sense of victory and satisfaction and contentment, we often get complacent. And many people who went through everything that they went through in Mecca and then migrated with the Prophet to Medina, or resided or lived in Medina prior to, they began to feel a sense of success in the company of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Messenger of God had established the government that he had established. And they were riding high, so to say, in comparison with many of their previous experiences. They were comfortable and they had the sort of contentment toward openly practicing their faith and religion, where, only a decade earlier they were being oppressed and killed and treated really, really harshly for believing in whatever it is that they were believing and having that sense of conviction. And they had to do it secretly, and now they're able to do it openly. Perhaps one of the reasons why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals this particular chapter of the Holy Quran is again to differentiate to the Prophet alayhi salam that there are individuals who are sometimes at the state of Islam and others who have reached the station of Iman, like we spoke about last week. That there are levels to belief and that there are levels to faith. That proclamation of tongue is not comparable with conviction of heart. Anyone can proclaim anything with their tongues. It's easy to do so. What we actually believe in our heart, that is what needs to be cultivated. I can tell anyone that I love you, but at the end of the day, if I'm not showing that sense of love, is that real love or no? I said that I love you. I said that I love this particular object. But if I'm not showing via my action, my behavior, the way that I communicate, so on and so forth, that I truly love you, or I love this object, or I love this person, or this thing, or so on and so forth, that my language is going to fall on deaf ears. You follow what I'm saying? So over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to remind the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, as well as the believers, that your statement and your offerings of conviction and loyalty to the Prophet and toward me, meaning toward God, at the end of the day, truly I'm able to determine what is prevalent in your hearts via your action and via what it is that I'm able to see in terms of depth. And like we said last week, that there are multiple layers to Islam, there are multiple layers to Iman, and amongst the highest stages that we can attain is a state of utter and absolute certainty, that feeling of the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at every given instance, and that desire to consistently be in a state of His pleasure and proximity. So let's go back to these verses of Surah al-Insan, once again beginning with verse number 1 to recap what we talked about last week, as well as to throw out some other insights. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, هل أتى على الإنسان حين من الدهر لم يكن شيئا مذكورا. Has there been for man a period of time when he was not anything worthy of mention? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking this rhetorical question. And according to some commentators of the Quran, that when God's posing this question, He's not posing it as a question so much as He's stating, or He's making a statement of certainty. هل أتى على الإنسان, meaning that there absolutely has been a period of time when humanity has not been worth mentioning. Last week we talked about what this means for us personally. We came from nothing and we're going to end up nothing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has assisted us on this journey of life. And there was a moment when I was not worthy of being even in the imagination of my parents. If we look at it from a more broader scope, or the macrocosm of the individual, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He makes mention of the creation of Adam toward the angels in that epic story of creation, mentioned in Surah al-Baqarah, chapter 2, verse 30. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, for instance, Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa, that I am going to appoint a representative, a vicegerent on this earth, meaning Adam. I'm going to create Adam. And how did the angels respond? They stated, oh Allah, and how and why are you going to create a creation when you have us? وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّهُ بِحَمْدِكَ. All we do is praise you. All we do is worship you. Why would you create a creation that's going to cause bloodshed, that's going to cause fasad, that's going to cause corruption all over your earth? They weren't asking to protest Allah. They were asking perhaps for what is known as istifham. They wanted to know. They were generally curious, and they wanted to understand why God was going to create a creation like that of the human being. But the interesting part of all of this is, how did they know that human beings were going to act this way, in the way that humanity acts? Some commentators of the Quran, and we could probably deduce this from some of our ahadith as well as other verses of the Holy Quran, suggest that there was another creation that lived prior toward the creation of Adam, what we would call, Neanderthals, for instance. That they existed, but they hadn't reached the capacity that the human being reaches until Adam alayhi salam is present in front of them. Because he helps to solidify and to perfect their intellects and their ability to rationalize and deduce, and he shows them the difference between good and evil, just and unjust, and so on and so forth. But they were already aware of a creation, and the only thing that creation would do was cause bloodshed, seek toward procreate, so on and so forth, to fulfill their bodily desires, in other words. So over here again, some would state that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, هَلْ أَتَى عَلَى الْإِنسَانِ حِينٌ مِنَ الدَّهْرِ لَمْ يَكُنْ شَيْئًا مَذْكُورًا, there undoubtedly has been a time when mankind was not worthy of mentioning even. It's talking about that period, before we had reached humanity in the way that we perceive it. Meaning there was a period of time where your forefathers existed with no objective, with no goal, with no purpose. But now you have a purpose. إِنَّا خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِن نُطْفَةٍ أَمْشَاجٍ نَبْتَلِيهِ فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. And God continues, and he states, and then we created humankind. So humanity existed, but they were not worthy of mentioning until now, until this moment. إِنَّا خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِن نُطْفَةٍ أَمْشَاجٍ نَبْتَلِيهِ فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. Indeed, we created the human being from a drop of mixed fluid. And we talked about what that means last week. نَبْتَلِيهِ فَجَعَلْنَا, to try them so that we can test them. فَجَعَلْنَاهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. And we have endowed them with both hearing and with sight. Meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us potential. He's given us ability out of His grace and out of His kindness. But at the same time provided that we go through trial, that we go through tribulation, that we go through ups and downs of this life. And we cannot attain that station of calling ourselves a human being and attaching ourselves toward God until and unless we go through these trials of life and we accept them and we thrive in the midst of them. It would be nice, for instance, if we never had to go through difficulties. We might assume. It would be nice if I never had a problem in my family and we all got along at every moment and I never got into a fight with my spouse ever. But in reality, that doesn't happen. It would be wonderful if I never had to worry about money and that I just had always enough to purchase and spend on whatever it is that I wanted. But that's not the case. It would be amazing that if I wanted to learn something, I didn't have to go and read a book and sit in front of a teacher and study. I just wanted it and I got it in front of my mind, to the forefront of my mind. But that's not possible. We go through these trials, and through these trials we are also molded. And through this molding we grow. And through those experiences we learn. And through all of that we progress. And it's consistently these stages of life that we walk through week after week and month after month and year after year and decade after decade. And then we realize decades later, 50 years later, that wow, through all of those experiences I've gotten here, all of those ups and downs of life, they put me in a position to be successful. Because if I didn't have that, I wouldn't have this today. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, إِنَّا خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ مِن نُطْفَةٍ أَمْشَاجٍ. You came from nothing. You came from impurity. نَبْتَلِيهِ. And we have put you in this world, and we have given you the ability to see and the ability to hear. This incredible blessing that you came from nothing, yet you've become everything that you've become. But know that in order for us to continue to grow and continue to progress, it's vital that we go through these trials and tests. Until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He states, إِنَّا هَدَيْنَاهُ السَّبِيلَ إِمَّا شَاكِرًا وَإِمَّا كَفُورًا. Indeed, we have guided the human being to the path, whether we be grateful or whether we be ungrateful. Guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes from two ways. The first is what is known as the internal guidance, and the second is what is known as the external guidance. The internal guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us is what is known as the fitrah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created us with a light, with the potential to be receptive toward truth, toward reality, toward that which is important. He has given us the ability to be curious, to be receptive, to rationalize. And if we didn't have that gift of having the capacity to contemplate and to be reflective and to meditate, then we wouldn't have anything. But we're able to come to conclusions on the basis of that which we see around us. The second type of guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala offers us are the external, like more sort of obvious manifestations of guidance. God has given us the Quran as the book of guidance. He has given us the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from Adam to Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, as the guidance that takes us from darkness into light, from ignorance into knowledge. هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةِ. God says this within the Quran, that through these prophets, we are guided. And once we combine these two together, meaning we combine this fitrah, this innate quality that we have to be curious, with the external guidances of the Quran, of the Prophet and his teachings, peace and blessings be upon them, at that moment, we have the easiest path towards success. Let's go to this first one, for instance. God created us with this fitrah. And it's so obvious that we have this potential to be reflective and contemplative. And the only place that you need to go to is look at a child who's 3 years old. A child at that age, they're always curious and they're always asking questions. They don't understand and they want to learn. They ask, why is the sky blue? Why is the grass green? Why is it raining? Why is it sunny? Why is it not raining? Everything there's a question for. Question after question after question. What gives them that desire to ask those questions? Did someone tell them, hey, you should be asking these questions to your parents and driving them crazy? Like we probably all did as well? No. It was innate. It was innate within them that they asked those questions. A child when they're young, have you ever seen the first time that like a baby is like put on the grass or in water, in a pool? How many of you have seen it before? What happens? They're so excited, right? The first time that their feet touch grass or that they begin to crawl on it. Or you see them playing with sand. Why do they love it? Because that's natural, right? This is artificial. That's natural. They love to be in nature. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us with that capacity. Again, over time we develop sort of an adverse relationship with all of those things. Because we become conditioned to think that being there is not as good as being here. And to ask those questions is like not important. But in reality, they're asking the most important question. Why is the sky blue? I have no idea. Why is the grass green? I have no... Maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put those signs for every single one of us to contemplate and reflect, but we haven't figured it out yet because we ignored the question because we didn't want to seek it. And again, if we start asking ourselves these questions, it's the easiest way to reawaken that dead intellect that is within us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us with that fitrah, with that curiosity. We're not supposed to close that door. But for so many of us, myself, everyone, we've closed it, society has closed it, family, whatever it might be, so it becomes so difficult to reopen it again. Well, we're taught that amongst the ways to reopen that door and to re-enlighten or reinvigorate that light that is within us is to go back toward asking questions. You don't need to look for an answer in a book, nor do you need to look for an answer by asking other people questions, but ask the question and think about it. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala create me with, 10 fingers and 10 toes, not 9? What's wrong with asking that question? Nothing wrong with asking that question. Why did God create me with eyes on my face and not on my feet? Why do I walk on 2 and other animals they walk on four, and others they walk on their stomachs. To ask ourselves, I don't have the answer to these questions. My whole point is that through reflection and contemplation of them, we have the capacity to sort of invigorate that light of the fitrah within the human being. In addition to that, if we're able to supplement it with the external guidance, the guidance of the Holy Quran, of the text that preceded the Quran, of the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Inna hadaynahu sabil. God has told us in this verse number 3, that surely we have guided the human being to the path, to the right way, to the easiest way getting toward Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inna hadaynahu sabil, imma shakiran wa imma kafura. I think we left off at this line last week. Whether we be grateful or whether we be ungrateful. And we said that shukr is a demonstration of gratitude and praise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And a lack of ingratitude or kufr is to cover the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has encompassed us with. And it's so easy for someone to neglect those blessings that God has given us that have been made apparent to us, that allow for us to be taken toward that truth. So it's very easy for us to ignore the signs of nature, the sun and the moon and the stars and so on and so forth, like we talked about last week. And at the same time, it's very it's very, very difficult to be in a state of gratitude for them and to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you've made, your creation and the reality beyond your creation so clear to us. Because a child from a very young age can also determine that there's someone who is more authoritative than him or her at a very young age. They know that they have to be in a state of submission to their parents, at least, a child. When we get older, we all of a sudden assume that all power and authority is within us, and that no longer do we need to be in a state of submissiveness or servitude to someone who's higher, and of course that being Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inna hadaynahu sabila imma shakiran wa imma kafura. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues. He states, Inna a'tadna lil kafirina salasila wa aghlalan wa sa'ira. Inna al-abrara yashrabuna min ka'sin kana mizajuha kafura. He states in verse number 4, Inna a'tadna lil kafirin, and surely we have prepared for those who are faithless. Salasila wa aghlalan wa sa'ira. In verse number 4, God speaks about divine punishment. How many of you have this chapter in front of you open right now? It's chapter 76, verse number 4. What does verse number 3 translate as in your translation? 3.
Indeed, we have guided him to the way, be he grateful or ungrateful.
Okay. Indeed, we have guided him to the way, be he grateful or ungrateful. The word for ungrateful in verse number 3 is kafura. Okay? Keep this in mind. What do you have for translation of verse number 4?
Indeed, we have prepared for the faithless chains, iron collars, and a blaze.
The word for faithless in this verse is lil kafirin. Okay? The previous verse says ungrateful. The next verse says faithless. I want you to keep that all in the back of your mind and remember what I told you last week, but for those of you who are not here, just to reiterate again, the root word of both ungrateful and faithless is kafara, kafir. Inna hadaynahu sabil imma shakiran wa imma kafura. The next verse states, Inna a'tadna lil kafirin. Okay? What I'm trying to demonstrate to you is that both of these verses are speaking to one another. Verse number 4 is a direct continuation speaking about what is going to take place to those who are ungrateful of the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And remember, for those of you who were here last week, that a lack of gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's blessings doesn't mean when I don't say thank you, oh Allah, for giving me whatever you're giving me. It doesn't mean that. When we talk about gratitude and showing of thanks is not sufficient via words. It's also conducive toward action. With gratitude comes responsibility. with the blessing that we receive, we have to act in accordance with what it is that we've received. Remember we gave the example that if I borrowed $1,000 from my parents and then bought coffee with all of those $1,000 and didn't do something meaningful with it, right? At the end of the day, they're going to ask me, how did you spend the money? I say, every day I went to Think Coffee to buy a cup of coffee. And they're going to be like, are you crazy? You could have made coffee that was way cheaper in your own house, right? You follow what I'm saying? With anything that I've received, even if it's a favor, there has to be a responsibility or an accounting of it. Get what I'm saying? So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us blessing, He gives us life, we're oftentimes not in a state of gratitude to Allah. We don't say, oh Allah, thank you for giving me life. When God gives us health, we often forget that God has given us good health until we lose it. I was just talking to somebody earlier today, and I said that yesterday I had very bad allergies, okay? And it was like miserable. I think because it rained the day before. It's been raining the whole last freaking week, right? Every day. And I was like sneezing all last night, and I wasn't feeling so great. And so I ended up taking some Benadryl, and I went to sleep, and I woke up this morning and I felt great. And I didn't think about it until 4:30 p.m. in the midst of this conversation that, wait a minute, today's been pretty good. I haven't had any symptoms of my allergy. And I did not even think for a moment to being in a state of gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for it. Yesterday, I was miserable because of it, right? For some sneezing and some coughing and for a little bit of a scratchy throat. The next day, I feel totally fine. And my mind, what happens? Completely negligent to the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed me today with good health. With that, showing of gratitude also comes responsibility. What didn't I do yesterday that I could have done today with my good health? Was I more present in my conversations with people? Did I spend a little bit more time in recitation of Quran, in active ritualistic worship? Whatever it might be, right? I don't know. Any blessing that we have, gratitude is testimony of tongue. Thank you, person, for giving me this gift. Thank you, Allah, for blessing me with this blessing. And along with that is a demonstration or a fulfillment of my responsibility. You know, in one of the du'as of Ahlul Bayt, du'a Arafah of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, which he recites on the day of Arafah, this really, really beautiful du'a. He says, I can't remember the exact lines, but he says, oh Allah, and you have endowed me, you have blessed me with eyes to see, and with ears to hear, and with the tongue to speak, and with the feet to walk, and with the hands to grasp. You've blessed me with all of these blessings. And not only have I not been in a state of gratitude to you for them, but with every single one of them, I've disobeyed you. With my eyes, with my ears, with my tongue, with my feet, with my hands, with every one of the blessings that you have given me. Not only have I not shown gratitude to you for them, but I've also committed acts of disobedience to you with the gifts that you have given me. Think about it. Who's more deserving of consistently asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness? More than I. More than us. And yet He still gives us tomorrow. You think that if I went and I took these $1,000 from my parents and I bought something really dumb with them, that the next time when I ask them for $1,000, they're going to be giving it to me without question? Or they're going to come to me and say, hey, here, have $1,000. Just without me even asking? Who would do that? Who would do that? Think about it. Who would do that? No one. Not one person. Not one person. Not even the ones who was closest to us. Not even our own parents. They wouldn't trust us anymore. They would make sure that we earn back that trust before they give us that loan again. Right? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, without question, you can have another healthy day tomorrow. It's okay. Even though you weren't grateful to me today for it. How kind, how merciful, how loving is this Lord of ours? And then what's going to happen tomorrow? Are we going to remember or we're not going to remember? What are the chances we're going to remember? Maybe we could set some alarms on our phones, and even then we're going to distract because we have something else too busy going on at that time. Think about it. When we talk about amongst the objectives of this chapter of Surah al-Insan, is to humble ourselves, to remind ourselves of our purpose in existence, really it's that. Our purpose is to being in a state of submissiveness and servitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at every moment. At every moment. Going back to verse number 4. إِنَّا أَعْتَدْنَا لِلْكَافِرِينَ سَلَاسِلَ وَأَغْلَالًا وَسَعِيرًا. And surely we have prepared for those who are ungrateful for my blessings. سَلَاسِلَ وَأَغْلَالًا وَسَعِيرًا. Chains and iron collars and fire. Briefly, we touched on this last week, my friends. Amongst the reasons why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to his punishment is undoubtedly to place fear within our hearts. And we talked about what fear means in a lot of depth last week, and I don't want to get into that conversation again today. Because once in a while, we need to be in a state whereby we look within ourselves or we get shaken to the core, and that might be the means by which we put ourselves in the direction that we need to put ourselves on. I liken it to this example every time, right? And again, a lot of the Quran speaks to punishment. And again, the very next verse talks about punishment, and we'll get there in a moment. But I liken it to this example. The first day in a college classroom, the first day you walk into a college classroom and you are going through the syllabus with your professor. What does every single syllabus talk about in the attendance section, right? Everyone is expected to come in on time. If you don't come in on time, don't come to class, right? More than 2 absences, you drop a letter grade. I don't accept late papers. Everything, right? To the core. Day 1, everything is very strict. You go the first day in your place of work, all right? After everything was all, roses and tulips and everything was wonderful, right? Leading up to it, you accept the job. First day on the job, you better be in at 9 a.m. You better be here till 5 p.m. No coming in late, no leaving early, right? Your lunch break is 30 minutes. You can't take 20. You can't take 31 minutes. Everything is strict. Why? Because at the end of the day, we want to be able to set some sense of protocol, right? And have a sense of authority in the workplace, in the classroom, so on and so forth. So there is a sense of rigidity. Over here, when we hear that day 1, we're very much inclined to making sure that we're getting our act together from that moment onwards. I'm not saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to hold himself to these words, like your professor or your employer might not necessarily do so. But at the end of the day, it's meant to awaken us, because sometimes that's the best way to be accountable, when someone else is holding us to account. You follow what I'm saying? So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he states these lines, and when we read these ayat, it's meant to awaken something within us to tell us, wait a minute, I better get back to where I need to be. I better be focused. I better make sure that I'm being in a state of gratitude and thanks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I better make sure I'm fulfilling all of my responsibilities to God, because if I don't, إِنَّا أَعْتَدْنَا لِلْكَافِرِينَ سَلَاسِلَ وَأَغْلَالًا وَسَعِيرًا. But what's different from your professor and from your employer and the way we compare to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that many times it will be closed at that end. You better show up on time. You better not come late. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always demonstrates his mercy and his leniency every time he speaks about punishment, by speaking about rewards. إِنَّ الْأَبْرَارَ يَشْرَبُونَ مِنْ كَأْسٍ كَانَ مِزَاجُهَا كَافُورًا. Indeed, those who are amongst the abrar, those who do good, يَشْرَبُونَ مِنْ كَأْسٍ كَانَ مِزَاجُهَا كَافُورًا. They should drink from a cup seasoned with kafur. I looked this up because someone had a question about it last week. That kafura, camphor, is a symbolic in Quranic language and in the 6th century as anything that was refreshing and that was cold and that had a really, really nice scent to it. Meaning that for those who are in a state of non-gratitude, so to say, of ingratitude, of ungratefulness, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold them to account in the way that he'll hold them to account. But for those who put forth an effort and who show that sense of gratitude and who appreciate the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that surround them, that for them they will get an incredible blessing that is physical, right? Something that we eat, something that we drink, something that is tangible. We like to hear those sorts of things. And that is going to be pleasurable. أين يشرب بها عباد الله يفجرونها تفجيرا. And this drink will come from a spring where only the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will drink from. And they will drink and drink and drink from there as they please. Meaning what? That for them is a lifetime filled with happiness and contentment and pleasure, where they are pleased with Allah and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with them. But it comes with a condition. يُوفُونَ بِالنَّذْرِ وَيَخَافُونَ يَوْمًا كَانَ شَرُّهُ مُسْتَطِيرًا. And we'll stop over here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, يُوفُونَ بِالنَّذْرِ. The way that we're able to receive that blessing, the way that we're able to attain that reward is, number one, they fulfill their vows. They fulfill their promises. Their promises to who? Their promises to their family. Their promises to community. But more than that, their promise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We made a promise to Allah that we would be the best of His servants. We made a promise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that if we receive these blessings, we're going to hold ourselves to fulfilling our responsibilities to them. وَيَخَافُونَ. And that we will be in a state of this fear. يَوْمًا كَانَ شَرُّهُ مُسْتَطِيرًا. We're fearful of that day when everything isn't going so well for many people, meaning the day of judgment. We fear what's going to happen on that day for us, meaning that we take precautions during the course of our lives. And when we take a precaution, we're that much more careful with every one of our actions. If we don't know what's going to happen on tax day, we take as many precautions as possible, saving as much money as we can, so that in the case that we have to return a lot of money to the government, we're prepared for it. And what happens when the government comes back and tells you that, guess what, you don't have to pay so much money in taxes? People get happy, right? Why? Because they took every precaution possible, so all of that money that they saved that they were going to give to the government, they can put in their pocket. That's a good feeling. Is that fair to say? So in other words, if we take precaution and we think and reflect and exert ourselves with every focus on detail and attention, or attention to detail in every one of our deeds, in every one of our actions, in every one of our conversations with others, that demonstrates a fear of being held to account by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we don't want to slip up. يُوفُونَ بِالنَّذْرِ وَيَخَافُونَ يَوْمًا كَانَ شَرُّهُ مُسْتَطِيرًا. They fulfill their vows and they fear a day where ill will be widespread, meaning they fear the day of judgment. We'll talk more about this verse in detail next week. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyina Muhammadin wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.